And it is now time for Expanding Awareness, and you are tuned to 90.3 WZBC in Newton. And on Expanding Awareness, I do present programs, most often covering some aspect of the paranormal. I might feature a holistic health topic, and we cover animal rights and progressive ideas and such. And with us are Connie Baxter Marlow, and she is a descendant of Mayflower Pilgrims, John Alden and Priscilla Mullins. Her great-great-grandfather, James Finney Baxter, is a preeminent historian of early New England, and he was president of the New England Historical Genealogical Society for 20 years. And when he died in 1921, he left money to the city of Boston to build a New England Pantheon to honor the early settlers of New England, whose principles and ideals were the seed of free government. Unfortunately, the Pantheon was never built. The trust was broken, and the money was recently been committed to the Boston Public Library, which invited Marlow and Bailey to premiere their film Seeds of Freedom, A Vision for America, and we'll be talking about what that film is. And that happened in the fall of 2016 to inaugurate the library's Baxter Lecture Series. And Connie brings her perspective to her ancestors' dreams of humanity, in which she spent 30 years in close association with visionary Native American elders throughout the U.S. and Mexico, and has been creating forums for them to share their understanding of the nature of the universe for over 20 years now. And also with us is Andrew Cameron Bailey, and he calls himself a Latter-day Pilgrim. He sailed across the Atlantic and arrived in America on Thanksgiving Day in 1969. And he was born in England and grew up in South Africa amongst the Zulus, and he holds degrees in science, English, and social anthropology. And he was a chemistry professor before settling in New England. And let's see, and the ongoing after meeting Connie in 2003, he became disturbed at the level of misinformation in the American psyche surrounding the settling of New England. And so we're going to talk about all of that. And Andrew and Connie are authors, filmmakers, and futurists who share an uplifting vision of the future of humanity. Their book, The Trust Frequency, 10 Assumptions for a New Paradigm, and their film, In Search of the Future, What Do the Wise Ones Know? It brings together indigenous cosmology, quantum science, and Eastern and Western mysticism. And so we're going to talk about all of that. That is a mouthful and a half. Good morning to you folks.
Good morning. We're happy to be back on your show.
Yeah, Victor. Happy Thanksgiving coming up this week.
All right, let's take it from the beginning. Day one, all right? Pilgrims arrive. What day, what year is that, and what happened?
All right, so they made landfall on November 9th, 1620, after 66 days at sea, and arrived way later than they should have and intended to, and apparently arrived at a different location. They were supposed to enter the mouth of the Hudson and settle in New York, and did not. As we well know, they landed very close to where you are sitting right now, Victor.
Okay, and how were they received? How were they greeted? I do understand that a lot of the Indians, had visions of white people coming. So do you want to talk about that aspect and how things progressed from that point?
Well, one thing we want to let your folks know is that we have been working with a project we call the First 50 Years, and that has to do with the peace and friendship that occurred between the Pilgrims and the Indians there in Plymouth for 54 years. And our perspective is that brought forth a synthesis between the European colonists and the American Indian that gave birth to the American mind, spirit, and democracy. And that this is a very important perspective on this story because there's a unique situation existed there in Plymouth for that 54 years. And there's now archaeological evidence that's coming to light that shows that, in fact, these people did interact very closely, and it was an intercultural exchange that occurred during this 54 years. So that's the perspective we're bringing, and it's a very important shift from victim, perpetrator, who did what to whom, and when that happened, and how, and what, and where, and because there's so many stories and so much misinformation about this time period that the only thing we feel is only way out is up to a higher perspective, and that's what we're bringing to the party, which you weren't able to share in our bios. Didn't point that out in the bio parts of our bios that you read. So we just want everyone to know that our work has to do with bringing the indigenous way of knowing into our paradigm. That's a fundamental part of our what gift we're bringing to the party of human consciousness and expanding awareness, is that the indigenous peoples have been carrying clues to the true nature of the universe through their creator-based paradigm, their trust-based paradigm, which the Mayflower Pilgrims shared. We wanted to have this hour to talk about the spiritual alignment of the two people. The Mayflower Pilgrims, who had a creator, a providence-based, God-based paradigm that had to do with a direct connection to the divine, a direct relationship, and as do the Native Americans. The Native American is a creator-based, great mystery-based, direct relationship with the creator of all things, and they shared a very distinct common belief system, the Pilgrims and the Indians. So that's what we'd like to, have this as a foundation for this discussion.
But weren't the Pilgrims very Christian in their outlook?
They were indeed. They were people who were so Christian that they'd had to break away from the corrupt Church of England and redefine their Christianity based on the Bible, which had recently been translated into English, which changed everything. The entire Protestant movement and the Reformation came out of that fact. The fact that the Bible, instead of remaining in Latin and Greek, was now available in your own language, whether that be German or French or Spanish or English. That changed everything, and the result in England in the late 1500s, during the latter years of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, a movement began to emanate from Cambridge University, and it was academic theological scholars studying the Bible, really being able to do it for the first time, and realized that the way it had been interpreted up to then by the Pope and by the Holy Roman Catholic Church, for example, was very different from what was actually stated in the Bible. So they began to make up their own minds, and they decided that, firstly, the church was corrupt and needed to be purified, which is where the word Puritan comes from. However, there was a subset of the Puritan movement who realized that actually it was an impossible venture to attempt to get rid of the bishops and the corruption and the bloatedness of the English church at that time. So they decided to separate and do their own thing. They became known as the separatists. And there's a very big difference between the Puritans and the separatists. The Mayflower Pilgrims were separatists. You could not practice that religious observance in England without committing treason, because King James was the head of the English church, as Queen Elizabeth today is the head of the English church, the Anglican church, known in this country as the Episcopalian church. So quite a history there, quite dramatic. A lot of the story of actually their suppression and having to do their religious practice in secret and getting busted for doing so and escaping from the country and getting to Holland, which was very liberal then, as it is today. And spending 12 years in Holland. However, Holland had had a war with Spain, and there was a truce in place, and that truce came to an end in 1621, and there was the real possibility that Catholicism would be reimposed on Holland at that point, and the separatists would lose their right to practice their religion the way they saw fit, which was a big part of their choice to leave and sail across the Atlantic and land on these fair shores. That a little bit of useful background there, Victor?
Yeah, of course. All right. Now, what do we know about the language barrier, and how did that evolve to be able to communicate with folks who have a totally different language from one another?
Well, I'm quite sure you believe in miracles. And the miracle of that one was a man named Squanto. Most Americans have heard of Squanto or Tisquantum, who had spent at least one significant period in England, back starting before 1614, in fact. So at some point, Squanto had either been taken to England, maybe captured, maybe going as some sort of outreach diplomat. We don't know the story there. There's a man an English skipper named George Weymouth in 1605, who we know took 5 or 6 Native Americans from New England to England, where they remained until they were later returned to their home country. Squanto may or may not have been one of those. We'll probably never know. It's very difficult doing this historical research back into specifics like that. Here is something we do know. When the Mayflower arrived in Massachusetts Bay, and when they came ashore at Patuxet, which John Smith 6 years before had renamed Plymouth, present-day Plymouth, Massachusetts, there was nobody around. The place was deserted. There were, in fact, skeletons and skulls on the shoreline. Something obviously terrible had occurred. John Smith described a thriving community with as many as 2,000 warriors. There was no sign of that. And something obviously had occurred. We now know that there had been an epidemic of a disease that had wiped out a very large percentage of the coastal Native American populations, all the way from Maine and Nova Scotia, all the way down, literally almost to Cape Cod. Coastal. Something had come down the coast and wiped out the Indians. When Squanto was delivered home to his people...
Well, you left out Hunt. So you have to
that's okay. There's a whole other story.
No,
I know.
That's important. People know that he was taken by Hunt.
Okay. All right. So some people may know that Squanto was captured a second time. He may have been manipulated into the capture of roughly 20 young Native American men from Patuxet.
And what year was
of the Patuxet tribe. That would have been in 1614. And with John Smith's associate, or by John Smith's associate, a certain Captain Thomas Hunt. I think his first name's Thomas, yeah. So, Squanto found himself back in Europe, knowing the English language, having previously spent time in England, having learned the language, having befriended a bunch of English sailors and businessmen, and having lived in London. And he was now all of a sudden taken, and this is sort of a jump, but he'd been recaptured, taken to Spain, to the slave market at Malaga, where all of those Native Americans were put on the slave market as slaves. Brilliant move on Captain Hunt's part. He thought he was going to make a bunch of money doing that. Didn't work because nobody wanted to buy them. And the Indians were finally taken in by some priors, by some Catholic monks who looked after them. And again, long story short, Squanto was able to get on a ship, get himself out of Spain, get himself back to Newfoundland, and finally get himself back to London, where he reconnected with his friends. And not until either late 1619 or early summer, more likely the early summer of 1620, Squanto managed to get himself back to Patuxet, back to Plymouth. And when he got there, that situation had changed radically. The village was gone. The 2,000 warriors that John Smith had described were gone. His people were gone. The Patuxet people were gone. He describes 2 old men and maybe a few other stragglers out of that entire community, the Patuxet tribe, were gone, devastated by a disease, as it turns out. However, here's Squanto, able to speak the English language when the Mayflower arrives. That's the miracle I mentioned. I mean, without Squanto to act as an interpreter, your question, Victor, was to do with the language challenges. They had a translator. They had an interpreter. The first Indian they met, they didn't meet any, other than one violent encounter at Nauset, where they were actually attacked. They were exploring the shore, and they were actually attacked by a group of native warriors and fired off some muskets, and the guys ran away. And I didn't see anybody else from the time they landed until on March 16th of 1621, this tall, handsome Indian comes strolling into their camp where they were building their little settlement in Plymouth, and freaked them out, as you can imagine, by all of a sudden, here's this man, unarmed, and basically they describe him as naked. He sounds like it was March, and he was wearing a loincloth, and they were dressed in their, their winter woolies. Anyway, long story short, Samoset is the first person they meet, the first Indian person who has a little bit of English. He was from Mohegan Island in present-day Maine, and he knew a lot of the English sea captains and had learned a little bit of their language. He said to the Pilgrims, the so-called Pilgrims, who, by the way, had just gone through the first winter and lost 50% of their company, there were now 14 adult men, 4 adult women, and 34 children. That was the invading, colonizing party that people talk about. And I'm being a little ironic there. Samoset said to the group that he knew another Indian who spoke much better English, and he would go and come back in 5 days with this other man. The other man was Squanto. When Samoset came back with Squanto, the rest is history, because Squanto had been staying with Massasoit, who was about 46 miles away in present-day Mount Hope, Rhode Island, and was really the nearest large tribal settlement. And Massasoit was pretty much the Grand Sagamore or sachem of the surrounding tribes, those who had survived the plague, the epidemic. By the way, the Narragansett had not been touched by it. Just a few miles away over in present-day Rhode Island, the Narragansett was still could raise 3,000 warriors, which was of great concern, no doubt, to Massasoit, who now had 90. These are numbers that you can assemble from the writings by the English at the time. So the language barrier was overcome by the miraculous presence of Squanto, who then brought Massasoit and his brother Quataquina to visit. It happened to be on the spring equinox of 1621, and they sat down together, and in a very, very friendly fashion, Connie could even read you something. There are these accounts that we have collected, these various statements that were written at the time. They crafted a peace treaty.
First they kissed.
First they kissed. No, come on. It wasn't.
No, they did. The governor kissed his hand and the king kissed him.
Yes.
And so they sat down.
So that's pretty darn friendly. I mean, if you and I met and we kissed, people would look at us like, so what the hell's going on, right? But they did. Point being that they crafted a mutual protection or peace treaty, 6 points, very simple, that was honored impeccably for the next 54 years, which is extraordinary. That's not a common thing. It was the one treaty it was the first treaty between English and Native Americans, and it was not broken until 1675, when the Indians broke the treaty, by the way, at the outbreak of King Philip's War. A lot of people think King Philip was an Englishman with a name like Philip, but that was not. He was the son of Massasoit, and he was the one who actually declared war, and it was almost the end of that phase of settlement in New England. It was, so I think you want to break in here, Victor. Let me hear what you have to
Well, I'm curious as to why did the natives declare war? I mean, what was their beef, if you will?
Yeah. That's a very complex question, but here I think is the essence. By 1675, roughly 22,000 additional English had arrived. The Puritans had arrived. John Winthrop and that entire colonizing group that came over from England starting in 1630. So we're talking about the very beginning. We're talking about Plymouth. We're talking about the Mayflower Pilgrims, who were separatists, who were quite different from the Puritans who started arriving in 1630 and landed first in Cape Ann and in Salem and in Boston. And it became basically the realization on the part of the Indians that they were losing their land, they were losing their culture. This is now, don't forget, this is now 54 years, more than half a century down the road, that they were losing their history, they were losing their land. And in fact, it's interesting, it appears, if you read Nathaniel Philbrick's book, simply called Mayflower, I think he's very accurate with regard to the history. And it would appear that Philip, whose name was Metacom, his Indian name, that Metacom was selling land to the settlers and spending the money on arms, on guns. Now, it was illegal for the English to sell arms to the Indians because they were aware of what the consequences could be. But there was an underground gun-running market run by the French and by the Dutch at that time that it was very easy. In fact, if all you needed was money and you could get guns. And Philip was busy arming, I believe personally, for the purpose of getting their land back. So the fact that they had lost their land, they developed a strategy which was to sell more land and to take the money, buy guns, and use the guns to eliminate the white people. That's
most advanced guns.
And they also had, I don't know if you know the difference between a matchlock musket, which was an ancient medieval weapon, and a flintlock, but there was a huge breakthrough. It's like the difference between a submachine gun and a Colt pistol. They were armed with flintlocks, which for example, were not affected by rain. So if you had a matchlock, you had to keep this wick burning, and if it rained and it got wet, you were out of luck. Your gun didn't work.
And that's what the Pilgrims had.
And that's the Pilgrims had. The Pilgrims were farmers. They were religious people. They were not, in any sense, warriors. So when the war did break out, it was really hard. And it's very understandable given the historical developments that happened in that first half century. That makes sense?
But our perspective, our emphasis is on the extraordinary exception to the human condition that actually happened at the founding of this country in Plymouth, that 54 years. So that's the emphasis that we want to put on this conversation, is that in fact these people lived in peace and friendship for this 54 years, and it's documented in their writings, in their journals,
in the primary source material.
In the primary source material,
actual documents written back by eyewitnesses.
Like, here's an example. We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them, and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them.
All right. Now, cosmology, okay. What, in your understanding, is, let's say, the primary principle of their spirituality, as opposed to the Pilgrims, as far as religion goes, as far as perhaps a wider spiritual perspective that the natives have?
Yeah, well, the natives have a creator-based paradigm. It's your direct relationship with the Creator. You go out on the hill, you cry for a dream and a vision quest, you get information, you get a name, you get a spirit guide. That information is a primary source for you and your tribe. It's an evolutionary process. It's not a dogma-based paradigm. It's a paradigm that's connected to all things, and that everything has a purpose. That everything it's a divinely orchestrated, creator-based way of life. The native people, and the Mayflower Pilgrims had a similar connection to the divine. They were providence-based paradigm. It was a God-based paradigm. You know, you trust in the Lord. You're communicating with the Lord. They had a very epiphany-based paradigm that you got a direct connection. You got information, and you followed that information. It didn't come from the church. It didn't come from priests and all that stuff. It was a direct connection. If the Native Americans were to truly open their minds and hearts and look at who these people were, they would find such a similarity that we're all missing now in our paradigm, because we're all oriented towards competition and scarcity and being out for ourselves and all that stuff. You know, we've walked away from our connection to a higher force and energy, and that's what's got us all in trouble now. If we just were to look at the commonalities of a providence-based, creator-based paradigm, we could move forward into a higher place, all of us.
All right, now, you folks produced a movie, a film called Seeds of Freedom, A Vision for America. Do you want to talk about what's involved with that, and where might people be able to view that?
Yeah, well, this film is 30 minutes. It's on our website, first 50 years, first50years.us. People can watch it online there. And it's really about the syntheses that occurred between the American Indian and the European colonists that gave birth to the American mind, spirit, and democracy. You see, the American mind evolved out of the European mind coming to this land and interacting with the Native Americans. It became something completely different from the European mind. And the whole American spirit, this whole thing of democracy and freedom and abundance and liberty for all that stuff is distinctly American, and it came forth from the interaction with the Native Americans. And so that's what our film is about, because we call it the first great synthesis, we call in Plymouth between 1621 and 1675. That very unique time of this intercultural exchange and the synthesis that occurred. The second great synthesis is when the great law of the Iroquois came into the Constitution. And it was Ben Franklin's assignment in 1750 to go to the Iroquois make a peace treaty, and he understood he saw what they had done with their confederation, and that they had brought unequal, different sized tribes together, and in this under this great law. Well, that's what they were looking to do for the colonies, these different sized, how to create autonomous colonies that are different sizes, different temperaments and all that, how to bring them together under a unified situation. And that's what the Iroquois had done with this great law.
The second great synthesis, right?
Yeah, so this is the second great synthesis we're calling, that when those principles came into the Constitution. And what we're calling for now is a third great synthesis. So we're coming together in our hearts to see what wants to be born now out of this mess that we're in. We're all in a big mess with the collapse of everything we thought was good and right, which really wasn't. And something new wants to be born, and we feel that it has to do with coming together with the native people, with the indigenous peoples of the world, and that we are going to create something new. So that's what the essence of that film is about. And Andrew has written a novel called The Mayflower Revelations to bring forth. He's not talking about the synthesis. What he's talking about in the novel, is the fact that there was, in fact, a significant time of peace and friendship in Plymouth. You want to say anything about that, Andrew?
The novel, it's called The Mayflower Revelations. It turned out to be pretty big. It's close to 700 pages. It's somewhat academic, but it's also very entertaining. It's a contemporary, kind of rather sexy novel about an exceedingly dysfunctional family of Mayflower descendants. And the story is actually set on the island of Barbados in the year 2020, so it's not an ancient history thing. It is a current contemporary story that looks back at what happened 400 years ago. So from the perspective of 2020, you're looking back at the landing of the Mayflower, and 400 years later, it's set actually over Thanksgiving of 2020, exactly the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower. And this family is split because half of them did believe one thing and half of them believe another thing. And there's a very big divide in the family as a result of that. And there are examples of that. I know families, I wondered whether that was a legitimate idea as a device in the novel. And I've spoken to a number of people whose families are totally split over their differing beliefs around what that early relationship was. It's a very big deal. It's a gem at the founding of this country that has basically been covered over. Subsequent events and there's no question that the Native Americans have ended up very much with the short end of the stick. Nobody's denying that. But what we're looking at is that bright, shining moment at the beginning where we actually coexisted in a very good way. And just stating that, hey, we did it back then, we can do it again, and we've got some attitudinal shifts to be made, and we need to open our hearts and accept each other and learn from each other. We could really move forward in a big way, and 2020 is a major opportunity for that.
Okay, I want to remind you that you're listening to Expanding Awareness, and this is Victor Robert Venckus, and with us online is Connie Baxter Marlow and Andrew Cameron Bailey, and they do present discoveries and conclusions drawn from many years of research into the 54 years of peace and friendship between the Mayflower Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Indians in Plymouth Colony. And, all right, here's a question. The controversy of calling natives Native Americans or Indians. What is your take on that?
Well, that's for them to decide. I read somewhere where they want to be called American Indians. It's so confusing that it's really not a matter of discussion. One thing I wanted to follow up on what Andrew had been saying was about this piece at the beginning of America. Last year, the Mashpee Wampanoags held an event at the Massachusetts State House at Thanksgiving, and it was called the Thanksgiving Unity Reception. Uh-huh. And the chairman, Cedric Cromwell, here, I just want to read a quote. "There's so much hate and divisiveness engulfing the country. As the direct descendants of the first Americans who hosted, we wanted to host a 21st century Thanksgiving reception to remind the world that the only path to peace and prosperity is one that includes all people. We want to encourage everyone to recommit to the positive dialogue and alliance that began right here with our ancestors nearly 400 years ago." So that's the Mashpee Wampanoags coming out and acknowledging the importance of this time for the future to inspire us to coming together and moving forward in our hearts on a higher level.
Now, I know you can't speak for Indians or all Indians, certainly. What, in your experience of working with them, did you find, do they at times resent white people, Americans, doing their sweat lodges and rituals and stuff?
Yeah.
Are they always welcoming or not? Or, again, we can't speak for everyone.
Yeah. Well, in my experience, who came into my life were the visionary elders, I call them. They were the ones who see the oneness of all people. Mm-hmm. They see that we're all one, that everything has a purpose, that we're all coming together, and that they would welcome anybody into the sweat lodge. So it just depends. You see, the point I make is about the first 50 years that Bradford and Massasoit were visionary leaders. They were high-frequency, high-vibration leaders that kept their people in peace and friendship, okay? There's that level of vision that's held by very few people in the world all through history. Okay, and so there's been the avatars, the messengers, the whatever you call them, the Jesuses and the Buddhas and all those folks. There's a different level of seeing and being, and so we're just dealing with all those levels of awareness. It's really your essential what you're trying to do or you're doing with your show. And that is expanding awareness, taking us to a broader understanding of the nature of things. And so, for me, the people who came into my life they all had any kind of person in their home, in their lives, but they weren't thought of highly by their people, because there are people that want to stay separate, that want to stay close, that want to hold on to and feel resentment and all that stuff. There's so much pain and so much intergenerational trauma and all that it plays a part in all this, because at the foundation of the Native way is what I call the pathway to the heart. Their cosmology, their way of life, their humor, their beauty, I see that and I resonate to that, and I spent my life to bring that forth as a gift to our people, all people who've been colonized. All of us have been colonized. We're separate from our hearts. We're separate from the force that drives all things and our reverence and sacredness of all life. How do we regain that? And that's what all our effort is to do, is to bring that way of knowing and take us all to a higher level so we can get up and out of the mess we're in.
What is your understanding of the natives, let's say, like worshiping ancestors? We often hear of connections with ancestors and how important that is.
Well, I'll tell you something. That's a very interesting question for me, because being a white New Englander, I just thought my ancestors were dead and in the ground, right? And and being in association with these Native people who are always talking about the ancestors and their relationship with the ancestors and all this stuff, I came to realize that my ancestors are driving my life. I mean, I'm descended from John and Priscilla Alden, who came over on that Mayflower. Priscilla's mother and father got on that boat with their two small children. Well, Priscilla was a teenager, but they were committed to something, and they were committed to some freedom of conscience for all of humanity. I mean, what those pilgrims did was astounding for all of us. And so, what they've done is driving me, and my great-great-grandfather, James Finney Baxter, who did this whole Pantheon thing, this whole vision, they're driving my life. So I would say that the ancestor thing that the Indians carry is a very important aspect of life for all of us to connect with and listen to our ancestors and to honor our ancestors and get guidance from them, because they talk to their ancestors all the time and get guidance from them. Andrew, what would you say?
Well, I would say this. I'm currently reading a book called The Intelligence of the Cosmos by the great scientist Erwin Laszlo. And it is specifically asking the question of, is there life after death? Does consciousness continue? Because if that is not the case, the ancestor thing is a fantasy. But if it is the case, it means that our ancestors are actually still alive, still living on Earth. In fact, right here in this room where I am in West Hampton Beach, New York, right now, can't see them, but they're here. And that's a very big change for the white Western worldview, but it's not a big change at all for the indigenous worldview. So I have a feeling that firstly, I am indigenous. I go back to ancient European and Caucasian roots, and my people were indigenous at one time, as were all of us. Then we started to migrate and travel, and suddenly we get this description that we are non-indigenous. Well, we're not indigenous necessarily to this particular land, but we all have our roots back there. And I believe those spiritual roots have to do with the understanding, the belief, and the profoundly deep basis for existence, that we do not die when we lay down the robe of our current body, that we continue. And that is the basis of, now I grew up in South Africa. I have a degree in social anthropology where I studied comparative religion. And this thing throughout that early anthropological discipline called ancestor worship. And, it wasn't ever worship per se. It's not ancestor worship any more than if you erect a statue of Jesus. You're not worshiping the statue. You're using it as a symbol of the energy that is or was Jesus. Certainly, I would say that Christians do not believe that Jesus is dead. They believe that he's right here, right now, and boy, is he ever an ancestor. So I think that the indigenous people, especially in this country, the Native Americans, have something they can remind us about, and that is that fact, which is now being validated scientifically. This is amazing. This book that I'm reading is astonishing in that it's a carefully crafted, carefully documented scientific book that is taking us in the direction of realizing that life does indeed continue and the ancestors are indeed real. And we might be well advised to pay attention to that fact.
Once again, the name and the author of the book?
The name of the author is Ervin Laszlo. He's extraordinary. He's the founder of the Club of Budapest. He's Hungarian, and he is one of the most highly respected scientists of the last 100 years. The name of the book, and he has something like 53 books under his belt. This is his latest one. The name of the book is The Intelligence of the Cosmos. And by that he means that there's an abiding spirit within the cosmos out of which we manifest. In other words, consciousness came before matter. The material world is an emanation from consciousness, not the other way around. And consciousness was here before the Big Bang. It will be here, whatever happens in the so-called future. And it's an amazing perspective on reality.
Okay. And we deal with this in our book, The Trust Frequency, 10 Assumptions for a New Paradigm, which is an indigenous cosmology quantum science synthesis. So we bring the indigenous and the science together in that book. So we highly recommend that.
Yeah, I don't mean to be putting out a plug for the book, but boy, it's worth it.
Okay. Peyote, any experience with it personally, and what is your understanding of its use in ritual?
So peyote, along with all of the other psychoactive substances, is a sacred plant that, when used in a sacred manner, we're not talking about recreational drugs. That's a nonsensical distortion of the reality. And anyone who's deeply into any kind of use of substances such as ayahuasca down in South and Central America, or peyote in the Sonora Desert, or so many other things, if approached from a sacred standpoint, strips away the veils between what we see right now and the ultimate reality, or a much, much higher reality. So I personally have taken peyote probably half a dozen times. It was a long time ago, and I didn't ever get to do it in a truly sacred way in the Native American sense of doing it in a teepee with my brothers and sisters.
So you listen to Pink Floyd on headphones, right?
I did not even do that. Actually, what I did do was go out into nature, and that was amazing. And the most memorable of them all, amazingly, I was living in New York City, and a friend of ours showed up with some peyote from out west, and here he is in Manhattan. I ended up on the roof of the building I lived in, on the roof, as the sun rose in the morning, and I was looking up into the sky, and the sky was full of, those amazing paintings from India that have Krishna and all the beautiful, Sure. That's what was going on in the sky above Manhattan, so my goodness.
Right.
Yeah, I've been in a Peyote Native American church out in the West, and frankly, I didn't take much of the peyote because I sitting around in the teepee with all those Indians, I was I was like, oh my God, I better just keep my wits about me.
Oh, boy.
So, but I have done ayahuasca and had an enormous teachings from ayahuasca, the sacred plant. So these are helper plants that the native people use to stay connected to this bigger reality. And it's a gift they have to bring to all of us, is this connection that isn't just theirs. We are one humanity. It's our true nature. It's the true nature of the universe. We're just separate from it, and we just need reminders and tools for how to reconnect and take the human potential to its highest place.
Right. As there has been misinformation about the relationship between Indians and Pilgrims, what use is it to present this misinformation, or is it just ignorance? Just it was so long ago that people lost track.
You know, it's not. It's very current. It's very bitter. It's very present right now, and it's the result of a campaign of misinformation that has been spread, I believe, poisonously and intentionally since at least the 1960s. And every Thanksgiving it rears its ugly head once again, and we get major Hollywood movie stars stepping up and quoting this stuff that is so far from the truth and just so divisive and so shaming to any white person. It makes you listen to this stuff, and if it's true, it makes you utterly ashamed to be a white person. And if you listen from a native perspective, it makes you, it makes you angry. So it's sowing the seeds of division and bitterness. And so that's one of the reasons I think it's important somehow to see if we can't counter that with the facts, because we do have facts as reported by eyewitnesses back in the day. And to try to say that, for example, one that I'm finding about 3 out of 4 Americans, not exactly in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts people are better informed, but the further away you get from Plymouth, the more likely you are to hear that the Mayflower arrived carrying a load of smallpox-infested blankets, just for example.
Mm-hmm.
Cher, in 2013, put out a tweet, "I do not celebrate Thanksgiving because they brought smallpox blankets to my people." Do you know, can you guess at the number of Native Americans who died as a result of intentionally provided smallpox blankets, Victor? Do you have any idea?
I do not.
Yeah, the number is 0.
But that did happen. I mean, there was...
It did not happen. You see, the fact is it didn't happen. It was discussed. It was discussed 143 years after the landing of the Mayflower. It was in the context of the French and Indian Wars, and it was a man named Amherst. Ever heard of a Massachusetts city called Amherst, or a college of that name?
Oh,
right.
Of course, sure.
Lord Jeffrey Amherst had witnessed at firsthand so many atrocities on the part of the Indians, and he honestly hated them and thought they deserved to be exterminated. And he wrote a postscript to a letter to a certain General Bouquet, who was in charge of the attempting to reimpose peace, or whatever the perspective was in those days. And he asked the question, would it be possible to use the term inoculate, to inoculate them with smallpox blankets? And in other words, it was proposed, it was investigated, it was never successful for a number of reasons. Firstly, how on earth would you do that without infecting yourself? Secondly, the smallpox bacteria survives for no more than 48 hours outside of the human body. So if somebody dies wrapped in a blanket and then you take the blanket, you would have to get it wrapped around some other human within 48 hours to have it even be possible. It was never, ever successfully implemented. Victor, not one Indian ever died of that, and yet 3 out of 4 Americans believe that to be true because some guy with a PhD said it, and nobody does their background homework.
You asked, what is the purpose of all this? And I want to say that I feel the purpose is because if you look at the higher purpose, the native way says there's a purpose to everything. If you take that as absolutely true, then and if you look at it through heaven's eyes, from a higher perspective, you can see that the story around the founding of this country in Plymouth was out of balance from the beginning, because it glorified the Pilgrims and left out the Indians. Okay, that was out of balance. There was a void. It wasn't a balanced story. The Pilgrims deserve every single bit of accolade that they were given. Okay, that's accurate. But the fact that the Indian was left out of the story, except for Squanto and Thanksgiving, that's inexcusable. And so the pendulum swung all the way over to make up for that void and that inexcusable situation, to demonizing the Pilgrims in order to honor the Indian. Well, that's as equally out of balance, and so it had to happen. We're all in a process, and we have to trust the process and know that the process is taking us somewhere. And what our perspective is, we take it to the fulcrum of the pendulum. We take the high road up and out, and that is that there was a synthesis that occurred, that these people lived in peace and friendship, and the archaeological findings are supporting that they had intercultural exchange. They were humans who had lost all their people. The Pilgrims had lost half of their people. The Wampanoags had lost 99% of their people. They were a grieving people sitting here on the edge of this continent, and they came together, and something astounding happened. When are we going to be ready to look at the light and the beauty instead of just going for the negative? And it's all perspective. You can call Metacom King Philip, you can call him a hero, or you can call him a villain, because he started a war that decimated his people. It took them out, 100% took them out, and he wouldn't stop. Okay, was he a hero for his people, or was he a villain? Did he take them down and take them out? He broke a peace treaty. He declared war. He murdered people in their homes, people they'd been in friendship with for half a century. He came and murdered women and children in their homes.
Yep.
Is that okay? Because they were losing land and all that. Is he a hero? Is he a villain? It's all perspective. And so, we can take a perspective that says, hey, something beautiful happened at the founding of this country. The Indians and the Pilgrims came together. A synthesis gave birth to something, which is called the United States of America. It's called the American mind. It's called liberty, justice, freedom, and equality for all. All
right, we have a little bit of time left, but I have to ask, who was Pocahontas, and why is it an insult to be called that?
Let me tell a quick story here.
Sure.
I was walking along the street in Aspen, Colorado, a couple of years ago with my sweetheart, and my sweetheart is this person sitting next to me here, Connie, right? And a car drives by, and the window rolls down, and a head sticks out, and the word Pocahontas is yelled out loud, directed at Connie.
By a 12-year-old boy, a friend of my son's. And as far as we're concerned, Pocahontas was it's a beautiful story. She was an amazing person, and it's an honor to be called Pocahontas, no matter who you are or where you are. So, everything is twisted and turned and made a negative. We've just got to stay in alignment with our own hearts and keep our vision on the high side of things. And there's something called providential history. Providence, watching providence, keep one's eye out for how the divine is working through us to take us to peace on earth and heaven on earth, to cleanse us of our shadow, to take us to a higher place. Otherwise we just take our focus and take us down a downward spiral. And who wants to go there? Let's go up and know that we can become something amazing.
I think to be called Pocahontas is a huge compliment.
Okay,
whatever
good.
The intention of that rather famous nut job who used it recently.
Yeah. Okay. I understand that you folks do have a website. What might one find on that, and what is it?
Well, we have a few websites. We have first 50years.us. That's this First 50 Years project. And I'll tell you something, we're going to be we're in partnership with something called Unity Earth, unity.earth, that's the website. And they have a program they're calling Road to 2020. And it's taking place throughout the world, and it's honoring the unity of all people. And they've got one coming up in India and in Jerusalem. And then in 2020, there's going to be a caravan across the United States, all the way from California to New York. And this, we're in partnership now with them to help tell this story. You know, get some scale to this story, because it's time for us to see this beautiful kernel that sits here at the founding of the country. So our website is first50years.us,